Welcome, everybody. This is the last of 5 for the summer season for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. Welcome. Thank you for being here. And I know all the rest are going to be watching the recording, I hope. All right, now let me just see. I'm going to try to share my slides. This is the part that gets me a little nervous, as you know. I'm already starting to stutter. And now I'm going to share. And you're going to tell me if you can see it. And there's a nod. Oh, good. And now I'm going to move it into place so that I can see it. And here we go. And yes, I'm Martha Stark. And here we go. Okay, good. And I figured out a way to access the chat. All right, navigating the relentless hope of patients with borderline features. And let me say, I've stepped into the realm of being politically correct. I don't say borderlines. I say patients with borderline features is what I now say. If I slip a little bit, please forgive me. An integrative approach to developing evocative memory, mentalization, and the capacity to grieve. I've got a lot of material, so I'm going to go kind of quickly, especially through the first part, and then we're going to get to containing statements, integration statements, and mentalization statements. Yes. And mentalization statements, come to find out, are at the core of my Model 3 of the Stark method of psychodynamics energy, the intersubjective approach to contemporary relational theory. It's like, oh my God, Dr. Peter Fonagy, his wonderful material on mentalization. I mean, it's totally relevant for my Model 3 being a story about character disorders and borderlines, i.e., patients with character disorders, patients with borderline features. Okay, here we go. Okay. Many patients refusing to confront and grieve unbearably painful truths about the objects of their desire, whether infantile, contemporary, or transference, spend a lifetime in pursuit of something that never was, namely the longed for experience of perfect or idealized caregiving. And on some level, I think this applies to just about all of us at some point or another. More specifically, their unrelenting search, or maybe our unrelenting search for perfect emotional resonance / empathic attunement. In other words, their desperate longing to be deeply seen, securely held, and never abandoned, never forsaken, betrays their refusal to accept. And refusal is important. I'm not saying inability, I'm saying refusal. I'll explain more in a second. Betrays their refusal to accept the limitations, the separateness, and the unyielding immutability of their objects. The simple but devastating reality that those objects cannot be forced to be something they are not. Now, I put this on record, didn't I? Gina, did I put this on record?
Yes, it's recording.
Thank you. Thank you, Gina Kwan. All right. And so they remain inescapably trapped in a futile quest, clinging to a dream that can never be realized. And I refer to this unwavering, aching need for idealized perfection, idealized caregiving, this lifetime of yearning for the impossible. I refer to this as relentless hope. Now, at the core of relentless hope, then, is this relentless pursuit of the unattainable, a desperate craving for something that can never be, a persistent wish for things to be other than the way they are, fueled by the illusion of perfection or the perfectibility of self and other. The relentlessness of the pursuit arises from the developmentally disrupted narcissistic need for perfection, age appropriate at the time, but traumatically thwarted, as opposed to optimally thwarted, which is going to become relevant in the treatment. But early on, age appropriate, but traumatically thwarted early on by the caregiver. Now, some talk about parenting, and some talk about the mother. Again, here too, I'm going to be a little more politically correct. And for the most part, when I'm just talking, I'm going to be talking about caregiver, but parenting, mothering person, fathering person, grandparenting person. Anyway, age appropriate at the time, these narcissistic needs for perfection, but traumatically thwarted early on by the caregiver, never worked through, reframed, or integrated, and thereafter relentlessly present. Unfortunately, this infantile need for narcissistic gratification does not simply persist as is. Rather, it becomes what we call defensively reinforced over time, intensifying precisely because it was never adequately fulfilled. Now, the relentless hope of patients with narcissistic vulnerability, the ones I've been talking about, um, those who have not yet fully relinquished their infantile need for or pursuit of idealized perfection, what I've been talking about, previous slides, differs subtly from that of patients with borderline personality disorder, BPD. For the latter, the hope is far more layered, anguished, and complex, arising not merely from a refusal to grieve, but from an inability to do so. Because of their seriously compromised capacities for both evocative memory and mentalization, which is what this talk is going to be all about, these patients, the ones with BPD, find it nearly impossible to hold in mind the memory of past good in the face of present bad. Think about that. In the face of present bad, they can't evoke the memory of the good that had been, nor can they imagine that it could ever be good again. Again, we're going to be calling this evocative memory or evocative memory capacity, which actually is a building block for mentalizing capacity, Peter Fonagy's mentalizing capacity. Unable, therefore, adaptively, and I talk about the distinction between defensively, which is less healthy, it's when it's too much to be processed, integrated, and adapted to, taken in one stride, defensive reaction versus adaptive response, the more evolved, the healthier ability to deal with or manage or handle the stressors that are coming your way. So, unable, therefore, adaptively to internalize whatever good there once was, and unable to because they can't remember it. They cannot, therefore, big price, preserve within themselves even a piece of the original experience of external goodness. And so, tragically condemned to repeat, they remain tenaciously caught in the web of their relentless pursuit. And again, this isn't just for our patients, it's for all of us. I mean, although this right here was patients with narcissistic features. So maybe not necessarily all of us on that, but you understand what I'm saying here. Oh, all right. So some of you may know this, others you may not, but as it turns out, in November, in person, the International Society for the Study of Personality Disorders, I was invited to be on a panel, Be Still My Beating Heart, with Peter Fonagy himself. There you have it, Martha Stark, Harvard Medical School, and Nancy McWilliams, my friend Nancy McWilliams. Oh my God, Be Still My Beating Heart. And we're going to be talking about mentalizing and borderline patients with borderline personality disorder and relentless hope. So anyway, all right, now many patients, at least to some degree, so back to many patients, struggle with emotional dysregulation, insecure attachment, precariously established self-esteem, distortions in self-concept, trust issues, and relational dysfunction. Like who doesn't? But as I will be suggesting throughout, patients with borderline dynamics carry an additional layer of nuance and complexity, characterized by profound psychic fragility, emotional volatility, anguished heartbreak, defensive splitting, more on that later, dysregulated impulsivity, and a tendency, therefore, to act out impulsively, destructively, and a pervasive sense of having been deeply betrayed. More on that in a moment. These are the elements that set them apart. That fuel a uniquely grief-stricken, tormented, fragmented, internally chaotic, and often crisis-ridden existence. Their fractured experience of being is such that intense emotions feel like maelstroms, each one a turbulent, all-consuming force, pulling them ever deeper into an existential vortex of confusion, helplessness, and despair. Now, as it happens, and you never quite know how you get a reputation, but I know originally my reputation as a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, was working with difficult patients, patients with multiple previous failed therapies. In time, it became working with patients with borderline personality disorder. And so initially, not so much, but in time, it became something that I loved doing. I love working with borderlines, but that's in part because containment, integration, and now mentalization. There's a way to handle them, I do believe, such that they become your favorite patients. That is true. So anyway, I have a lot of experience over the course of the decades working with borderline patients. And I'm very lucky. It just happens I've never had any one of them actually kill themselves. That's mostly luck and some skill. All right. Oh, this is what makes working with such patients with borderline features in treatment especially demanding, although ultimately extraordinarily rewarding. So these patients can quickly become a formidable opponent, fiercely combative when triggered, particularly because of their notoriously limited capacity to contain themselves. An important word here for patients with borderline features in the face of disillusionment, disappointment, rejection, loss, perceived threat, or emotional overwhelm, ultimately leading to the well-known and almost inevitable acting out, although maybe we would say enacting if we're going to be even more politically correct, but for the moment I'm going to say acting out, of their crushing pain, profound despair, and entitled outrage. All of this notwithstanding the tender and soulful vulnerability of the patient, her exquisite sensitivity, passionate intensity, disarming authenticity, and gift for deep relational presence when able to feel safely held and truly seen, make of her at times a sheer pleasure and absolute delight to engage with in treatment. I've had some of my most precious moments of meeting with patients who have a lot of borderline features. And once you've kind of gotten them settled into the treatment and they're feeling sort of securely held and truly seen, they can become an absolute delight to work with because in many ways they go deep. Okay, the longing, the fear of abandonment, the intensity, the tenderness beneath the rage. All right, so real quick, like Melanie Klein, she talked about the paranoid schizoid position characterized by preambivalence, and then the depressive position, the next developmental position, ambivalence. There you go. What insights does psychoanalytic literature offer us about the etiology of borderline psychopathology? So, the patient with borderline features operates from what Melanie Klein refers to as the preambivalent stage of development, the stage that characterizes this early paranoid schizoid position, in which others are experienced as part objects, as either need gratifying and all good, or need frustrating and all bad. This primitive developmental position is also marked by ruthlessness, a lack of concern for others, said Melanie Klein. Because patients with borderline features can only partially navigate the preambivalent, ruthless, paranoid schizoid position, they will, when interpersonally stressed, often regress to this early stage of part object usage. where self and object representations are rigidly split into all good and all bad. In other words, you might not realize initially that it is a patient who, when interpersonally stressed or emotionally overwhelmed, will indeed regress or revert to pre-ambivalence and defensive splitting into all good or all bad. So indeed, when emotionally overwhelmed, patients with borderline features, i.e., therefore unable to maintain the more integrated stage of ambivalence, which is the defining characteristic of Melanie Klein's depressive position, will often regress to the earlier developmental stage of preambivalence. Now, as will soon be explored in greater detail, the overarching goal of treatment then for such patients will therefore be to support a more sustained and cohesive progression toward the developmental stage of ambivalence, already partially attained yet precariously held. In other words, the aim in the treatment, one way to describe it, is to foster advancement from the paranoid schizoid position. This is the way it's often written about in the literature, but others since have written about it a little differently, including Peter Fonagy and me in a way a little bit. Anyway, from the paranoid schizoid position, marked, I mean, not so much by me, actually, not so much. Anyway, from the paranoid schizoid position, marked by defensive splitting of good and bad, a fragmented self and part object usage, where others are experienced as either entirely need gratifying or wholly need frustrating, to advance from that paranoid schizoid position to the depressive position, marked by adaptive integration, not defensive splitting, the less healthy, but adaptive integration, the healthier, of good and bad, a cohesive self, not a fragmented self, and whole object relating, not part object relating, where one can hold in mind simultaneously the beloved and repudiated aspects of disillusioning objects. Think about what might happen in the transference of positive narcissistic self-object transference in the face of an empathic failure. So what had been all good, suddenly, oops, all bad. The disillusioning self-object therapist has made an empathic failure, and the patient with tenuously established ambivalence can then easily enough revert to splitting, unable then to hold in mind simultaneously the beloved and repudiated aspects of the disillusioning object, you the therapist, as well as the nurturing and destructive aspects of the self. Okay, now Margaret Mahler, and I hope Judith appreciates this because Margaret Mahler and Fred Pine, one of her mentors, worked and wrote together. They wrote about the separation individuation process, especially the rapprochement subphase. Probably Jean-Francois can pronounce that better than I can, but especially the rapprochement subphase of the separation individuation process. Okay, borderline difficulties have often been linked to challenges in negotiating Margaret Mahler's, this was a little later, 1975, separation individuation process, which extends from about-ish 5 to 36 months. This is a sensitive developmental period during which the young child begins to differentiate herself from the primary caregiver, usually the mother, said Mahler, and gradually develops a sense of individuality, a separate identity, as she moves toward greater independence and autonomy. Now, within this process is the rapprochement subphase, which is about-ish 15 to 24 months. It's especially critical. Sensitive and critical are important words when we're talking about developmental stages, because it is during this time that the young child, trapped in the push-pull between autonomy and dependence, struggling to move away from the mother, yet still needing her for emotional refueling, is highly vulnerable to abandonment trauma and to the impact of inconsistent or unattuned parenting, caregiving. It is believed that the caregiver of a child who later develops borderline issues, often herself organized around a borderline structure cannot tolerate the child's age-appropriate movement away from her. It's hypothesized that. More specifically, the child's emerging drive towards separation and autonomy is experienced by the narcissistically vulnerable caregiver not as a natural developmental progression, which is what it is, but as a profound personal betrayal. The caregiver experiences it as that, a psychic wound internally registered as emotional abandonment. So, as the child begins to separate and individuate, such a caregiver will therefore enact, this is important, a pattern of radical inconsistency, at times smotheringly present and psychically engulfing the so-called smother mother, and at other times inaccessible, withdrawn, or emotionally absent. She will be alternately overprotective, intrusive, and demanding, and at other times hostile, rejecting, and emotionally distant. This is a living dramatization of her own unresolved internal split, which she is externalizing and enacting or acting out in the relational field, leaving the child in a constantly shifting relational experience that oscillates between being engulfed and being abandoned. Because such patients then have been subjected to the confusing and disorienting whiplash experience of swinging abruptly and uncontrollably and unpredictably back and forth between a traumatically disillusioning and heart-wrenchingly unreliable caregiver and a mythically idealized and heartwarmingly, though precariously available one for these young ones whose mothers or caregivers were themselves organized around a borderline structure, such that over time, the child has no choice but to adopt a world view defined by black and white. That's the way it's written about in the literature, with little room for nuance or shades of gray. The caregiver's seductiveness, so we're thinking Fairbairn's seductive mother, who alternates between exciting and rejecting her child, is a source of profound distress for the vulnerable child. First, this seductive mother, enticing and compelling, and then crushing, devastating, and abandoning. And elsewhere, I talk about how that lays the groundwork for, oh, good. Oh, thank you, Dr. Ava. Yes, I did indeed mention Margaret Muller. Yes, indeed. Thank you, Dr. Ava. I believe that this seductiveness, Fairbairn's seductiveness, mother, lays the groundwork for sadomasochistic dynamics, and not even necessarily schizoid, but more sadomasochistic. But anyway, moving on. Okay. On some level, and this is interesting, it would probably have been less tormenting for the child had the caregiver been simply all bad, rather than fluctuating unpredictably between the occasional moments of being very good and the far more routine default of being very bad. At least then the child would have had a clearer sense of where she stood. So it's counterintuitive on some level, without being held captive by the uncertainty and the destabilizing ambiguity of never knowing for sure which caregiver would appear. In any event, in the face of the caregiver's erratic inconstancy and her often unwitting seductiveness, again, we're talking about patients who later develop borderline features, the impressionable, helplessly enmeshed young child is subjected to the agonizing experience, think of this, of encountering, on rare occasions, an exciting and tantalizingly gratifying object, and then, more often than not, a rejecting and painfully frustrating one, with the young child having no idea as to why and not getting it that it is primarily a story about the caregiver and maybe the caregiver's reaction to the young infant's gradual, age appropriate separating and individuating. Okay, this experience offers the child, the back and forthness, the whiplash experience, the fleeting gift of being able, at least for brief periods, to bask in the warm glow of something deeply cherished, only then to have it jarringly, inexplicably, and invariably wrenched away again and again. And in fact, sometimes we therapists will be in the position, unwittingly, not quite realizing it, of being there and then not. That and since I kind of do think of in the treatment situation everything a la Model 3, the intersubjective space, as being co-created, admittedly, we're the one who are there and then not because they've gone too far. But of course, that might well be a reaction to what the patient's doing. But what the patient's doing is a reaction to what we were doing. So there's this, and that's Model 3, and Darlene Ehrenberg's negotiating at the intimate edge becomes so incredibly important for patients with character disorder features and borderline features. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. But anyway, so the experience of back and forth, the gift of being able to bask in the warm glow of something deeply cherished, only then to have it ripped away inexplicably, leaving the child feeling betrayed, stunned, achingly alone, desolate, and agonizingly bereft, forever longing to return. In Michael Balint's poignant words, to the harmonious, interpenetrating mix-up that had once defined, at least in fantasy, her engagement with an emotionally available, loving, and yet paradoxically unpredictable caregiver. Now, let me say, and I'm realizing I haven't emphasized it perhaps as much as I could have or should have, I'm distinguishing between the relentless hope of people, patients now, but all of us, who would want a certain something, perfectly attuned, empathic attunement, emotional resonance, idealized caregiving, because we never had it. And so we're ever busy, relentlessly hopeful, wishing and hoping and praying that we'll get it now. We never had it, but we're wishing we could get it now. That's the way it will be for so many. And they will need to grieve that in the context of a disrupted, positive, narcissistic self-optic transference. But I'm distinguishing that from these patients with borderline features who had a different early on experience. And again, I'm talking about Melanie Klein and Margaret Mahler, where they had the experience of something very special, and then they didn't, and then they did, and then they didn't. So they actually had something, and then they lost it. They had it, and then they lost it. That's very different from the majority of people who never had a certain something. They just didn't. All right. So anyway, back to these people. As a result of these overwhelmingly confusing experiences for patients who later develop borderline personality, once the patient ventures out into the world, she carries deep within her a desperate longing to reclaim that which had once belonged to her, even if only briefly, that which can no longer be found, an idealized past that no longer exists in its original form, or perhaps never truly existed at all. In essence, it is an idealized past that is irretrievable, a paradise lost, never to be recovered. And again, this accounts a little bit for why there can be just an incredible honeymoon stage in the initial stages of treatment with a patient with borderline features, because they do go deep and they feel deep. And we as therapists, we go deep and we feel deep and we sort of connect, and it's sort of beautiful. Until the inevitable, because we're not perfect, and also the patient's exerting of pressure on us to fail them in ways specifically determined by their early on history. Thank you, Patrick Casement. We will inevitably end up failing them. And then the so-called shit hits the fan, because it does become too much for them. They can't remember. Not that they won't remember, they can't remember the good that had been, thus making it difficult for them to grieve, because to grieve, you need to remember the good that had been in order to internalize it adaptively so that you can preserve internally some of the original experience of external goodness. Okay, now I've just given away my whole talk, but that's okay. So in essence, it is an idealized past that's irretrievable for these patients with underlying borderline features, a paradise lost, never to be recovered. Okay, thereafter, the patient with borderline features will spend a lifetime frantically attempting to recapture those precious, ephemeral moments of blissful, deeply interconnected union once experienced with her caregiver. These are the magical but rare moments when, as a young, sensitive child, and it's important that we get this, that we understand this, when she had actually been briefly blessed with the captivating experience of idyllic, peaceful merger with a caregiver who seemed to cherish her, and the beginning stages of our treatment with her. But those precious moments are forever lost to her because you can't go home again. All right, so I read that book a long time ago. All right, so now evocative memory capacity, Joseph Sandler, real quick like, and libidinal object constancy, Margaret Mahler, again. Okay, so Joseph Sandler, real quick like, 50s and 70s, he introduced the concept of evocative memory, sometimes referred to as evocative memory capacity, in connection with his interest in actualization of past experience in the present, sort of more ego psychology. More specifically, the capacity for evocative memory is a developmental achievement that captures, said he, how early relational experiences can be evoked in the here and now of the therapeutic encounter. Wonderful concept. It allows the patient to bring past relational patterns into conscious awareness, providing a bridge between past and present, memory and current experience. Sandler described evocative memory as the capacity to summon to mind, evoke, not only a visual image of the object, but also the felt emotional quality of the relationship with the object, a re-experiencing of the object's presence along with its affective impact. And if a good one, obviously a good thing to have, a bringing of those feelings into conscious awareness rather than being overwhelmed by them. Now, let me say, and I should know I should go back to reread Sandler on this, was his focus mostly on evoking the memory of good or just simply evoking the memory of whatever was? I always sort of thought of it as good, but it occurs to me that I may be embarrassing myself here in a public forum because I'm not quite sure if it's good and bad or just good. So I have to, maybe someone in the chat's going to sort of fill me in on that. Anyway, so Sandler still, the capacity for evocative memory makes early affective experiences coherent and integrated, which in turn supports Fonagy's adaptive mentalization, about which I'm going to say more in a moment, enabling the patient to think about self and others in ways that are reflective, emotionally regulated, and contextually flexible. I think it must be just the positive stuff was his emphasis, but we'll see. Now, Heinz Hartmann, he's now in the 1950s, often regarded as the father of ego psychology, was interested in how the ego develops the capacity for stable internalization of objects. His focus, similar to Joseph Sandler's and the others, Margaret Mahler and the others, his focus, and Fred Pine, hello, Judith, his focus was on the ego's adaptive functions, including reality testing and affect regulation. To that end, he introduced the concept of object constancy. Again, similar. I mean, people can sort of describe it a little differently, but similar concepts. He introduced the words object constancy, an aspect of ego development, it's a hard-earned achievement, reflecting the child's capacity to maintain stable ties to objects despite frustration, ambivalence, or separation. So clearly kind of a positive thing here. Now, Margaret Mahler later defined, a little bit later, this concept, describing libidinal object constancy. So not just object constancy, which was Heinz Hartmann, she picked up on that. She and Fred Pine picked up on that and described it as libidinal object constancy, a crucial developmental achievement, one that highlights the emotional and affective dimension, More specifically, she emphasized the child's capacity to sustain a stable, loving, internal image of the caregiver. Yes, infused with libidinal or positive, libido, positive, loving investment, even in the caregiver's absence. In sum, Heinz-Hartman, object constancy as the ego's structural capacity for stability of internalized object representation, and Margaret Muller, a little bit later, libidinal object constancy as the ego's emotional achievement of enduring love and connection. And I actually, Fairbairn had already done it, but I actually, in some of my earlier writings, I actually wrote about self-object constancy, which kind of goes hand in hand with libidinal object constancy, as I think Fairbairn's does as well. It kind of, flip side of the same coin. Okay, Peter Fonagy, attachment theory and psychoanalysis. If that isn't a face that you just like love, I mean, and the little baby's face you love as well, and Peter Fonagy, I mean, what can I say? And the development of mentalization. Okay, Peter Fonagy in the 1990s introduced the concept of mentalization and mentalizing capacity, although for him it was an S originally instead of that Z, but it's become, by American, whatever, more the Z now, I guess. Highly responsive to environmental influences. This capacity, my eyes on the time, okay, is a hard-earned developmental achievement that reflects, I'm going to say this real quick, I can then get much more into it a little later, that reflects the ability to create and use mental representations, that always means internal, of both one's own and others' emotional states, more specifically, feelings, thoughts, beliefs, desires, intentions, motivations, all that, as well as to observe, understand, and interpret actions and behaviors, both one's own and others, as expressions of underlying mental states. Do you see how the capacity for mentalization is going to be at the heart of the negotiating at the intimate edge in my Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, being able to zero in on and focus on the here and now of the therapeutic or analytic engagement, being both attuned to one's own inner states and the others, and the impact of those inner states on what we then do or behave. It shapes our behavior, and a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and negotiating at that intimate edge, the intersubjective edtronics messiness that will inevitably emerge. Model 3, mentalizing capacity is what we want to support and foster. Amen. All right. The concept also speaks to the adaptive integration of cognitive awareness, cognition, affective experience, feelings, and behavioral expression, supporting coherent and flexible functioning across all three of those domains. And by the way, my Model 1 is about thought. It privileges thought. My Model 2 privileges feeling. And my Model 3 privileges more action. Model 1, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalytic theory. Model 2, the corrective provision perspective of self-psychology and other deficit theories. And Model 3, as I've been saying, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory, thinking, feeling, and doing, behaving. Okay, in essence, back to Fonagy, it is the capacity, says he, says they, he and Bateman and some others, to imagine, interpret, and make meaning of the inner worlds of self and others. Now, do you see that empathy is a wonderful something, but it's just sort of the beginning? Empathy is being attuned to and being able to sense and be attuned to what the other person might well be feeling. But it's not all about this extra stuff. It's just sort of what they're feeling. So it's part of foundational for the cognitive, conscious awareness, and then affective feelings, and then the behavioral expression. With the mentalization capacity is empathic attunement, and then some, and then way some. Okay. Let's see, capacity to imagine, interpret, and make meaning of. So it's about meaning making, the inner worlds of self and others, and to understand how these inner states, internal, shape behavior and actions. In their landmark 2004 paper, Mentalization-Based Treatment of BPD, Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman outlined a new approach to treating patients with borderline features. Their mentalization-based treatment, MBT, rooted in attachment theory, is informed by the observation that patients with BPD often lack a reliable capacity to mentalize, primarily because of inadequate, say they, attuned mirroring in the early attachment relationship. Not so different from what the others had been saying, but the focus a little more zeroing in a little bit in a way that's quite beautiful. All right, more specifically, say they, such patients lack a stable foundation for mentalization because the early caregiver had difficulty providing, their words here, contingent and marked affective displays in response to the infant's subjective experience. So I didn't quite sort of like, oh, what does that mean? So I looked and looked and looked and finally kind of got it, that I think it means, in other words, difficulty providing, the caregiver did, and now the therapist, or potentially the therapist, but the caregiver struggled to provide attuned responses that were both appropriate and clearly signaled. Now, they go on, Fonagy and Bateman, to highlight the bidirectional nature of mentalizing. And I always think of that as a game of ping pong or tennis or pickleball, played with two balls simultaneously, or even badminton. I'm a little bit more a badminton kind of gal, so the birds. Anyway, two people serving, totally bidirectional nature of mentalizing is central to how Peter Fonagy and his colleagues understand its developmental origins. Again, it's rooted in attachment theory, and formulate both the treatment, the process itself. It involves modeling by the therapist, and the treatment target, which is you want to get to the patient having the capacity for mentalization. Yes, for psychotherapy of patients with BPD, and I think I would say more generally for patients, period. I would say more generally for everybody, for them to be able to recognize the impact of their behavior. One, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, what goes along with it, where it came from, and the impact of it on others, and to be able to sort of feel your way into the other's inner state. I mean, this is a hard-earned developmental capacity. And to be able to think about and feel your way into the other person's thoughts and feelings, and how that might then have informed what they did, which might have been a reaction or response to what you did, which is a reaction or response to what they did. Beautiful. They write, the objective of reaching a state of improved mentalizing in the patient is reached through an interactional process whereby the therapist models. I don't know of any other theories that really highlight that the therapist models how it's done. And by the way, if you're in a relationship, I've actually used this with a number of my patients as they're struggling with how to deal with their partner who's never been in therapy and who doesn't have a clue, who is, as we say, unconscious. And sort of like, well, then why don't you model what it is to have mentalizing capacity, where you sort of reflect and put into words and make meaning of, well, I was feeling this and it occurs to me that I was reacting. Of course, I shouldn't have, because I realized blah, 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 blah. And by modeling what it is to be attuned to and able to make meaning of and put words to and understand both your thoughts, your feelings, and your motivations and intentions, that modeling is probably one of the most effective ways to teach the patient mentalizing capacity. Like, oh my God, I don't think anybody talks about that. And then along comes Fonagy. And sort of like, I lift that and so like, oh, well, I'm going to take that and put that into my Model 3. I mean, the folks who do Model 3, I mean, Darlene Ehrenberg and Stephen Mitchell and Jay Greenberg and Jessica Benjamin and so on, and Donald Stern and the others, they weren't really saying that at all. But along comes Fonagy, and by golly, he's saying it. Now he's focusing in more on patients with BPD, but quite frankly, across the board, I think it's relevant for anybody who has some, quote, noxious relatedness, Model 3, noxious relatedness. Remember, Model 1, neurotic, Model 2, narcissistic, Model 3, noxious relatedness, Model 4, non-relatedness, and Model 5, non-action. Anyway, All right. So anyway, they quote, they elaborate. In other words, mentalizing as an end target is achieved through the experience of being effectively mentalized. It is an implicitly processed, not explicit and real conscious, although it's also conscious, but this is their quote, so far be it from me to challenge that, but it is an implicitly processed experience as well as a target of treatment. So it's both the process and the destination. In mentalization-based treatments, they say, the therapist will mirror the patient's emotion, but in a slightly exaggerated or caricatured way, so that the patient can recognize it as both reflection on some level and modeling, their word, rather than the caregiver's own emotion fully taking over. So it's not like you sort of like totally get down and just do your thing. You're still a little more focused on modeling for them. Reflection, here's your feeling, and modeling, here's how to understand it. All right, moving on quickly here. Now, ordinarily, moving on, when a patient experiences a loss, whether real or merely perceived, she must ultimately confront the painful truth that something she once had is now gone. This facing of the truth and the evolution toward sober, mature acceptance is an essential part of the grieving process. Indeed, if the patient is ever to move beyond her experience of bereavement and loss, she must face and ultimately accept that something has changed forever. As part of genuine grieving, the patient will adapt. There's that word again, adapt, not defend. You defensively interject bad, you adaptively internalize good. The patient will adapt by taking in the good that had existed prior to the loss, preserving internally the original experience of external goodness. In the self-psychological literature, this process is referred to as adaptive transmuting, meaning in essence, structure building, internalization, an inevitable and felicitous accompaniment of genuine grieving. Now, it's adaptive in that it allows the patient to preserve something internally that she knows will no longer be available in the external world. All right, now the capacity to grieve is therefore central to the relinquishment of relentless hope. And in order to grieve effectively, the patient must have the capacity to remember. That is evocative memory, which patients with borderline defenses, we've been saying repeatedly, have not yet fully established. So if you have relentless hope, it's because there's something you're not able to provide for yourself. You never got it consistently, reliably early on, so you have model 2, structural deficit, self-psychology. And actually, someone had highlighted that it's not actually even just structural deficit. More specifically, it's self-deficit, impaired capacity to be a good parent unto oneself. That's sort of self-psychology with its emphasis not on Model 1, structural conflict, but Model 2, structural or self-deficit, impaired capacity to be a good, I always go like this, to be a good caregiver unto oneself, to be self-soothing, to provide oneself with caregiving and nourishment. So it's the deficit that creates the need for the object then to provide what was never provided consistently and reliably early on, and thus the relentless hope, the wishing and hoping and praying and refusal to confront the reality that it wasn't there then. Well, anyway, the refusal in the here and now, let's go, to confront the reality that it's not there. It's not there in one's world as one is living it. All right, so the capacity to grieve, though, is central, and patients with borderline features don't have that capacity. Because to grieve effectively, you have to have the capacity to remember, evocative memory. This enables empathic failures. So in the therapeutic relationship, and again, I've already hinted at moments of disrupted positive transference or disillusionment. It had the illusion of idealized perfection, idealized caregiving, only to have the empathic failure, creating thereby a disrupted positive transference. And there's the problem. That will need to be worked through, grieved, and ultimately integrated, but patients with borderline features can't do that. They can't remember that it had been good prior. In the process, though, the patient adaptively internalizes the good enough caregiving that it once existed. Yeah, my eyes on the time here. I think I want to, that. Ultimately, I don't want to do the rest of that. I don't even want to do this one. It's in you. The PDFs are available in the portal. So whatever. I don't think I want to. I think I've explained that enough. So in sum, patients with borderline features cannot yet grieve effectively, lacking solidly established evocative memory and mentalizing capacity. They cannot hold in mind the memory of past good in the face of present bad. Without evocative memory, there's no inner storehouse of good to draw upon in moments of rupture. And without mentalizing, there's no capacity to hold multiple truths at once, to imagine ambivalence or complexity. As a result, the psyche of the patient with borderline features defaults to splitting, which is the only way to manage what feels otherwise unmanageable. In other words, the absence of evocative memory and mentalization leaves patients with borderline features vulnerable to the tyranny of the moment, where present pain eclipses past goodness. And in really little babies, there's that there too, until they develop it. But when they're a little baby, it's age appropriate that they not yet have it. But when they're a big grown up and it happens and they can't remember, they literally can't because they don't have evocative memory. That's when, Houston, we have a problem. So where present pain eclipses past goodness and defensive splitting substitutes for adaptive integration. So you see how integrating good and bad, two parts both and I talk about it as, is obviously the healthy something, whereas defensive splitting, all bad or all good, that less healthy, less evolved. Okay, development of evocative memory capacity so that past good can be remembered in the face of present bad. All right, here we go. So I wanted to explore how we as therapists can facilitate the process by which patients held captive by borderline defenses, patients who therefore struggle to remember past gratification in the face of present disappointment, can begin to acquire evocative memory capacity and eventually mentalizing capacity, which is even a little bigger than evocative memory capacity. It is this emergent capacity, evocative memory, that will enable such patients to grieve disappointments once felt ungrievable, and gradually to shift from relentless pursuit of the unattainable to fuller acceptance of what is, and satisfaction with what is good enough or the approximately perfect. So the development of self-structure or uh, structure, the gradual emergence of caregiving capacity typically depends upon a prolonged process of working through frustrated narcissistic need, disillusionment. I hinted at that on an earlier slide. The child's, here are the two primary ones. Oh, there's no I in child's, but they're supposed to be. The child's longing for a mirroring self object to bathe the grandiose self in admiring light. It's okay to have that narcissistic need early on. Or for an idealized parent imago with whose calm strength the child can safely fuse, if only in fantasy. So the development of structure early on, or now here in the treatment, typically involves a prolonged grieving, a working through of disillusionment, a disrupted positive transference. That's the treatment in Model 2. That's the treatment, grieving, working through disrupted positive transference. But for patients with borderline dynamics, whose fragile evocative memory seriously compromises their capacity to grieve, the development of self-structure is not merely a matter of working through frustrated narcissistic need, but it requires something altogether different. Okay, giving it away here. The therapist as a containing self-object, necessary if the relationship is to continue. What the patient with BPD most needs is external containment. And I'm going to be suggesting that it doesn't involve optimal frustration, but actually gratification. That's a big statement. And it's not optimal frustration, because for the patient with borderline features, there is no such thing as optimal, because in the moment of upset, everything that theoretically could be optimal, i.e., the ability to summon up the good that had been, it can't be summoned up. So it immediately becomes traumatic, meaning you can't handle it. You can't. You just can't process it, integrate it, and adaptively internalize, because you can't. Okay, so for patients with borderline vulnerability and defensive splitting, when disappointed by the therapist, the once all good, gratifying object is instead experienced as an all bad, frustrating object. Unable to sustain ambivalence, which is what we've been saying all along, the patient regresses to the pre-ambivalent mode of primitive splitting, hate for the object instantly replacing love. The therapist once felt to be narcissistically sustaining during that honeymoon phase when all was well, is now experienced as having been lost, both externally and internally, leaving the patient overwhelmed by rage, panic, and a terrifying sense of aloneness. In desperation, and I had not been emphasizing that until I'm going to now, she becomes prone to enacting or acting out her outrage in a variety of indulgent, think libido, and destructive, think aggression, ways. What is therefore most needed, at least initially in the aftermath of an empathic failure, is external containment by the therapist. By containment, I mean holding and managing the patient's tendency to act out in response to her difficulty tolerating intense relational disappointment. In the aftermath of such disappointment, the patient is often tempted to sever her tie to the disillusioning object, the therapist. Her inability to handle relational disappointment, along with her sense of outrage and frustrated entitlement at having been thwarted, fuels her impulse to destroy and to flee from what has become intolerably painful. It simply hurts too much. If the therapeutic relationship is to survive, the therapist must set firm but caring and non-punitive limits. But firm, but non-punitive. So get it said in advance, not after the fact. So that would be retaliatory or punitive if it's after the fact. In advance, it's firm. Always against the backdrop of demonstrating, the therapist does, indestructibility in the face of the patient's attempts to annihilate her. One of Winnicott's lovely words, annihilate her. The therapist, through both verbal and nonverbal means, this is what the patient working with a patient with borderline features, this is what the therapist needs to be doing. The therapist must provide external containment of the patient's impulse. It kicks in immediately to act out because the patient suffers from a structural self-deficit, namely an impaired capacity to be self-containing. She cannot yet provide such containment for herself. This self-deficit, along with compromised evocative memory and defensive splitting, is a hallmark of borderline vulnerability. And any of you who have worked with patients with borderline features understand exactly, oh, yes, right, their impaired capacity to be internally self-containing. The heart of the treatment, therefore, lies in the therapist's steadfast preservation of the relationship and containment of the patient's impulsive, rageful, and destructive acting out. In her role as a containing self-object, the therapist therefore serves as a deterrent, neither withdrawing nor retaliating, even if at times she might be sorely tempted to do so. And if every now and then you do by mistake, that's okay too. But anyway, you strive to be someone who is not busy withdrawing or retaliating, but instead busy using containing statements, integration statements, and mentalization statements, which I promise you we're going to get to in a moment. No longer relevant here is optimal frustration, leaving space for the resourced patient to work things out internally. That is not what we're talking about here. Rather, when dealing with patients who lack the capacity to grieve, The therapist must directly gratify, not optimally frustrate, but directly gratify the patient's need for containment, not withhold it under the guise of providing growth incentivizing optimal frustration. No, because for patients with borderline vulnerability, there is no such thing as optimal frustration. Every disappointment of whatever magnitude is experienced as traumatic, as one that is unable to be grieved, unable to be mastered. Misguided, however well-intentioned efforts by the therapist to supply optimal frustration will therefore be no gift at all, and if anything, will simply serve to re-traumatize. For patients with BPD, every disillusionment becomes a traumatic one. Containment is the gift. Okay, containing statements. Here we go. Okay, we're good. The therapist must do everything she can to keep these vulnerable patients alive and engaged in the treatment. I'd like to suggest that the self-object therapist, when we're talking narcissism, we're talking about the patient's use of the therapist as a self-object. When we're talking more neurosis, model 1, we're talking more about the patient's use of the therapist as a drive object who either gratifies or frustrates a drive. But now we're talking about narcissistic needs, and we're talking about the therapist as a self-object. Model 2. So I'd like to suggest that the self-object therapist, and maybe at other times is a drive experienced as a drive object. You know, we models 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not just they are solidly model 2. It's sometimes they are model 1 or model 3, 4, 5. Although then there's an empathic failure, and then suddenly like, oh no, actually now we're talking more model 2. But anyway, so I'd like to suggest that the self-object therapist can use what I call a containing statement to help limit the patient's tendency to act out. So let me clarify what I mean. The containing statement is a particular kind of psychotherapeutic intervention that proves especially effective with such patients, although it can benefit others as well. By way of example, okay. Suppose the end of the hour has arrived and the patient remains seated, unmoving. Now, how might the therapist help the patient leave the office without shaming her and without creating a rupture too terrible for the patient to bear? So let us imagine that the therapist has been reading her self-psychology and therefore decides to respond empathically. And so the therapist says, "You would wish that you could stay." This is certainly a nice thing to say, validating. Yep, yep. The patient, feeling both understood and legitimized, nods in agreement, but remains seated. The therapist then recalls the advice about the importance of setting firm limits with patients who rely on borderline defenses. That is, the value of providing external structure to compensate for the patient's lack of internal structure and her impaired capacity for self-containment. And so the therapist says, "I'm sorry, but our time is up, and we do have to stop." Delivered with a certain kind of no-nonsense clarity. The patient, now enraged, just sits, rooted to the spot. Again, the therapist has said, "I'm sorry, but our time is up, and we do have to stop." My proposal then is use of a containing statement, a particular kind of intervention in which the therapist both supports by resonating empathically with the patient's affect and challenges by reminding the patient of what deep within, albeit reluctantly, the patient does indeed already know to be true. So it's sort of like, yes, all of my interventions, my prototypical interventions, have two parts. One that supports and provides more homeostatic attunement, a la Jim Herzog and Salman Akhtar, and the other that is more challenging, anxiety-provoking and challenging, and provides more disruptive attunement, a la Jim Herzog and Salman Akhtar. All right, so here we go. And so the therapist says, perhaps you would wish that you could stay, but as you know, our time is up and we do have to stop. Now, this containing statement first resonates with what the patient is experiencing in the moment, namely a desire to stay, and then reminds the patient of the reality of the situation. But not just the reality of the situation, but what the patient knows to be the reality of the situation, namely, her time is up. Now, let me also just sort of say, the sentence alone is one of many things, sentences and other things that the patient therapist will offer. This alone doesn't sort of like, oh, good, there we have it. But it's en route to what we want for the patient eventually to be able to develop the capacity to be internally self-containing. So there's no longer the same defensive need to act out emotional overwhelm in destructive, impulsive, and rageful ways. All right, but with this, perhaps you would wish that you could stay. But as you know, our time is up and we do have to stop. We first support by resonating empathically, thereby providing understanding. And then we challenge by reminding the patient of reality, thereby providing containment, restraint. Thank you, Gail. It's not quite a conflict statement, but similar. So thank you for that good question. I happen to see that pop up. Thank you, Gail. Dear Gail. All right. So first, support by resonating empathically, and then we challenge by reminding the patient of reality, thereby providing containment, restraint, and limits. Now, in a conflict statement, a Model 1 conflict statement, first, we get them anxious. As you know, as long as you continue to smoke, you're going to be more at risk for spreading your cancer, comma. But you find yourself thinking, I just need to be able to smoke. It's the only thing I do that gives me any real release. So first of all, for starters, the order is reversed. In this, with a containing statement, first we get the patient's attention by resonating empathically. You would wish, perhaps you would wish that you could stay. They say, But as you know, now you set a firm limit that's related to the here and now. Okay, good. But anyway, moving on. By resonating with the affect, oh, good, thank you, Gil. By resonating with the affect the patient is experiencing in the moment, we are attempting to engage her experiencing ego. So, right brain? And by reminding her of the reality of the situation, we're attempting to engage her observing ego, left brain. When we say, but as you know, our time is up and we do need to stop. Again, notice that we have strategically inserted the phrase, as you know. I think those are the three most precious words in the English language, which is why in Model 1, we will say, as you know. And in Model 3 here, with containing statements, we're also going to say, as you know. So that's a very nice association there, Gail. All right. So we've strategically inserted the phrase, as you know. So it's not just sort of like we, sort of like, I'm so all about you know that, sort of like, you could ask your parents to pay for the treatment, but you find yourself hesitating for fear that that would mean yet another tie. Is not as good as, you know, that you could ask your parents to support the treatment, but your fear is that that would mean yet another tie. Anyway, but you're putting the conflict more back in them. So it's not like you're saying, well, you could ask your parents for the tie, for the money, and so on. So you're highlighting the conflict within them and taking it out of the arena here. So anyway. So as you know, goes into the second half of the containing statement. We're determined to mobilize her observing ego, left brain, and to promote development of her mentalizing capacity. More on that in a moment. Now, by highlighting what she knows at her core to be her accountability. She's not an idiot. She's not psychotic. She does know. How does she know her time is up? She can read the clock. We are challenging her to take responsibility for her actions. We are insisting that she acknowledge the locus of control is an internal one. By emphasizing this element of choice, we are intent upon empowering her. All right, now dual awareness is being fostered when the patient is being asked to direct her attention to what she is experiencing in the moment, would wish, right brain, at the same time that she is being encouraged to step back from the immediacy of that experience in order to detach herself from the intensity of the moment, gain some distance, and recover a reality-based perspective. But as you know, In the psychoanalytic literature, this distinction between experiencing something, right brain, and observing it, left brain, is described as a healthy split in the ego or in the self between the experiencing or participating ego, would wish, and the observing or reflecting ego. But as you know, again, Richard Sturber way back, well, actually, he wrote it originally in 1934 or something, and Leston Havens, one of my mentors. May he rest in peace. Now, parenthetically, all the optimally stressful, growth incentivizing prototypical interventions in my Stark method of psychodynamic synergy, including these containing statements, including integration statements, including mentalization statements, are strategically designed to support the patient's dual awareness. One of the goals in any treatment, actually. Oh, there you go. Nice picture. Engaging both the analytic wisdom of the left brain, the observing ego, and the emotional, relational, embodied wisdom, hello, Ed, of the right brain, the experiencing ego. Okay, the therapist, here in her capacity as a containing self-object, will repeatedly offer the patient these containing statements. Interventions strategically crafted to provide containment by delivering just the right balance of support and challenge. Now, how do you know it's going to be the right balance? Because you're ever busy with your own mentalizing capacity and your ability to be empathically attuned and emotionally resonating. If you sort of overstep things a bit, you immediately backpedal a little bit and try again, softening it a little bit, or actually emphasizing a little bit more the challenge. So you're ever busy with your finger ever on the pulse of the level of the patient's anxiety. You're ever busy modulating and titrating your own intervention, how much you challenge, which will be anxiety provoking in the second half, versus how much you support, which will be anxiety assuaging, which is in the first half of a containing statement. So here we go. When you get angry like this, you think about taking flight. That's supportive. That's exactly what they were thinking. But we both know that someday you're going to have to stop running. Now, let me say, they may not necessarily love it that you said that, and they may even feel some anxiety. But do they know it? Here, too, I've said this about conflict statements. You can't cheat and say something they really don't know. You have to say something. No shortcuts here. You have to say something that they really do know. We both know that someday you're going to have to stop running. We both know, they know, we know. We've been talking about it over the course of our time. These statements are purposefully constructed to generate destabilizing internal tension and homeostatic imbalance. That's our goal. First, we ease the anxiety, and then we increase it. By weaving together anxiety assuaging support, resonating with the patient's feelings, and then anxiety provoking challenge, calling her back to what she knows, however reluctantly, to be true. And we're doing this, creating these optimally stressful interventions. Now, and sometimes when I'm supervising, the supervisee will say, but it's going to make them anxious. And so like, yeah, no pain, no gain. I mean, like, yeah. So we're not just about, I mean, we could be just all about support. But I know for myself, and again, one of my specialties working with patients who've been in multiple previous failed therapies, many of them got support, and that was great. But when they left the room and went home, they didn't have it anymore. They got it when they came back again, but when they left, it was gone. So we're talking more about deep embodied change, which means we need to create enough homeostatic imbalance and internal tension that we are sort of destabilizing the existent dysfunctional status quo of the defense and trying to superimpose something that's going to be more flexible, more resilient, and new good as opposed to the old bad. All right, so here are some. Now, some of you may gasp and like, oh my God, I'd never say that. But anyway, I've said all of these, and some of my supervisees, I asked, these are some are my own, and some are my supervisees. Here we go. You're hating me right now and thinking about killing yourself or breaking off treatment. But you and I both know that if you're ever going to understand why you have such trouble getting close to people, you're allowed to enjoy saying these, then someday you're going to have to slow down and give yourself a chance to figure out what keeps going wrong for you in your relationships. Here's one. I did this one. You'd been feeling so good about our work, understood in a way that you'd never before felt. And now you're feeling that I don't know you at all and that I don't care. But we both know that if I really didn't care about you, then I wouldn't have bothered to make myself available for this Sunday morning appointment. Okay. Additional examples that first support by resonating empathically with what the patient is feeling, and then challenge by reminding her gently but firmly of what both she and the therapist recognize as the ground she stands on. You think all the time about killing yourself to escape from the pain. But you know that if you did that, your kids would never forgive you. We know that you're in deep, deep pain right now and wishing that you were dead. But you and I both know that if you killed yourself, then your kids, whom you love deeply and would never want to hurt, your kids would never get over it. You just can't get rid of this conviction that if you feel hurt by me, then you get to do anything you want, including breaking the rules, which you and I both know we need to have in order for our relationship to continue. I'm reminded of a patient, oh my goodness, way back, this is decades ago when I was working at the Cambridge, well, now called the Cambridge Health Alliance, but where I did my adult residency in psychiatry. And I had been kind of in a way stuck with this patient who'd just been in so many previous failed therapies. Anyway, let's say her name was Janie. Janie. Anyway, she just got really mad at me one time and just, I mean, one of many times, but anyway, really mad at me. And she said, "That's it, I'm done." I didn't actually say anything. Admittedly, a part of me is sort of like, okay, you're done. Whew, alrighty. But I didn't say that. But nor did I say, please stay. I didn't do a containing statement. I didn't do nothing. She just ran out of the room, slammed the door, whatever. Ran to the emergency room, which was next door in the next building, and said to the mental health worker on call, Dr. Stark just fired me from treatment. And so my friend Ralph calls me up and says, well, Dr. Stark, did you just fire Jamie from treatment? I said, no. He said, can she come back? I said, absolutely. So anyway, she came back and we continued. But anyway, that just came to mind for me. All right. You think all the time about killing yourself to escape from the pain. Oh, I already did that. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, here, maybe the last one. Have I done? You just can't get rid of this idea that when you feel hurt by me, oh, yes, yeah, break the rules. You're allowed to retaliate, even though you know that such behaviors are destructive to our relationship and to the bond that we have worked so hard to develop. It is the therapist's external provision of containment that allows the relationship to continue. Isn't that cool? That kind of, whew. All right. Now, let us now consider the scenario of a patient with borderline dynamics who's continuously threatening suicide, yet equally insistent that she will never go willingly into a mental hospital. Does that put you in a bind? Absolutely not. The bind is not yours. The bind, or more accurately, the choice, belongs to the patient. You can therefore offer her the following suicide contract: a therapeutic intervention that contains, dignifies, and empowers. And I can't tell you how many times I have used this with my patients. And if you want, you can lift it and copy it. It's going to be slides 59 and 60. Okay. You tell the patient that she is, welcome to speak of, and in fact, you invite her to, and please do speak of, tell me about your despair, your hopelessness, your loneliness, your outraged disappointment, your fury at me, at the world, for not understanding, for not appreciating just how much you're suffering, for not making you better, and so on and so forth. Tell me, talk to me. That's fine, not a problem. But for her to know that from here on out, if she ever shares with you anything at all that sounds to you as if she might actually harm herself, then you will take that as her way of letting you know that she needs some form of external containment. Again, if she gives any indication whatsoever that she is even playing with the idea of hurting or killing herself, then she is to understand, knowing in advance, that you will take that as your cue to take action. And you will do so by insisting that before she can return to treatment with you, she will have to present herself to a psychiatric emergency room to be evaluated for her suicidality. So your very clear message to the patient is that if you talk about suicide or say anything at all that makes me think that you might even be vaguely considering harming yourself in any way whatsoever, I'm the judge of that, then I will understand that to be a signal for me that you're needing me to do something, that you're communicating a need for me to provide you with a clear, structured boundary to contain from the outside what feels uncontainable from within. Now, if the patient then retorts, well, if that happens, I'll just tell the doctors at the hospital they're not really suicidal. And then you get to say, oh, no problem. In any event, you won't be able to return to your treatment with me until you've been evaluated for your suicidality. Interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, patients usually test this non-negotiable limit only once, if even that often. And again, as I've mentioned at the beginning, a combination of a lot of luck and some skill. I've never had a patient who actually killed themselves, and I've worked with hundreds of patients with borderline features. Okay, the therapist is not only providing containment, but also offering the patient an opportunity to experience cause and effect firsthand. Indeed, an essential part of mentalization, as we'll be saying in a moment, is learning about consequences, coming to understand that provocative actions will have predictable outcomes. My eyes on the time, I got to move on. This involves fostering an empowering sense of responsibility, guiding the patient to recognize that certain behaviors will inevitably produce results. The therapist is emphasizing agency, helping the patient see the impact of her actions on others. Again, aligning with Fonagy's concept of mentalizing capacity. This is central to fostering the patient's understanding of how her behaviors are affecting both herself and those around her. To reinforce this lesson, the therapist might offer a containing statement, such as, although you might wish that you could keep talking about suicide and your desire to harm yourself, the reality is that if you do, I didn't even say you know. I forgot to say that. All righty. Next time I show this slide, it's going to have you know. You know that I will, because I've told you, that I would take it seriously and take the necessary steps to intervene. In sum, containing statements always juxtapose growth incentivizing support with challenge. Both are held in tension side by side. First, we provide holding, enabling the patient to feel understood, and then we invite or demand accountability, respectfully returning agency to her. When someone lets you down as I have, your temptation is to flee. Though we both know that if you ever want to have a relationship, then someday you're going to have to stop running so that you can figure out why you're so unforgiving, why you're so relentless, and what happens inside you when someone disappoints you. Or when you're feeling this frustrated and angry, your first impulse is to lash out. But we both know that if you're ever to get better, then someday you'll need to learn to put into words how awful you feel instead of acting it out in such desperate, destructive, and indulgent ways. The goal is always to strike a delicate balance between empathic resonance and developmental demand, between holding and accountability/empowerment. Containing statements strike an optimally stressful balance between empathic resonance and developmental demand. And also relevant, by the way, sometimes for young children who have quite significant ADHD, and how, as the parent, you can sort of provide some containment parenthetically. So some of my patients have found that to be especially useful. There's some more, so whatever. Okay, here we go. Integration statements. Let me now introduce, my eyes on the time, integration statement. A powerfully impactful intervention, particularly relevant for patients with limited capacity to integrate the good and the bad aspects of their experience, and who, when overwhelmed by unbearable affect, regress to defensive splitting. An integration statement can be masterfully or mistressfully employed in the aftermath of a therapeutic rupture. It is most effective in those moments when the patient feels so devastated, betrayed, and enraged that she simply cannot remember ever having felt good about the therapist. The therapist enters into the patient's internal experience because the therapist has mentalizing capacity of outraged devastation. Therapist enters into the patient's internal experience of outraged devastation and comes to appreciate that the good of the past literally cannot be remembered. They don't have yet that ego capacity or self capacity, I guess, self structure. The good of the past cannot be remembered, evoked by the patient in moments of rageful disappointment, nor can hope for the future in those same moments be imagined or envisioned. Integration statements support the containment and meaning making of conflicted conflicted feelings. They are strategically designed to foster emotional integration. In other words, the capacity to bear the tension of mixed feelings and to tolerate the nuance, the dissonance, and the inevitable ambiguity of emotional complexity. These interventions are useful not only for patients who routinely defend through splitting, but more broadly, for patients who struggle to hold in mind simultaneously both the tender and the wounded aspects of their experience with respect to self and others. In other words, integration statements are particularly effective for patients with fragile evocative memory capacity, the representational cognitive ability to recall past relational experiences and associated feelings, and whose love for self and others is tenuously held because of precarious libidinal object constancy, the affective emotional ability. The other was representational cognitive ability to recall, and now we're talking about the affective emotional ability to sustain positive feelings, libidinal cathexis, toward a disappointing object. Anyway, I hope you get the idea there. In these exquisitely vulnerable patients, the capacity to hold positive relational experience can be eclipsed in a heartbeat during moments of affective overwhelm. And sometimes, if we're not sort of attuned to this, it's sort of like, what the fuck? I mean, things used to be so good. And now I made one little slip, like, I'm sorry, excuse me. And now they're just hating you and want to flee. Okay, so for these emotionally labile patients, mostly patients, well, with tenuously established evocative memory capacity, affective intensity can eclipse access to the good, not only as memory, past, but also as possibility, future. So integration statements gently acknowledge the patient's difficulty holding the good in mind, whether recalling what was or imagining what might be in the face of bad. I should have said that, in the face of current bad or disappointment. So instead of saying, but just last week you were saying that you felt good about me and our work together, it's more helpful to say, when you're feeling this angry at me, and you feel how that's resonating with where they're at in the moment, it's hard to remember that just last week you were saying that you felt good about me and our work together. Do you see what we're doing here? First, you're naming in the here and now, you're getting it, you're naming it, you're with them. When you're feeling this angry at me, or this heartbroken, or this hurt, or this sad, or this betrayed, you're resonating with that. Then you don't just say, but just last week, which would be way too anxiety provoking, but rather you are resonating with the defensive, forgetting, foreclosing, not remembering, or maybe just not able, truly not able, either unwilling or not able. So it's hard to remember. That's resonating empathically. I'm sorry. Yes, it's a nice way of saying it, but that just last week, here's the challenge. You were saying that you felt good about me and our work together. Or when you're feeling this bad, it's hard to remember that you ever felt good and hard to imagine that you could ever feel good again. When your heart is breaking as it is now, you can't imagine that you could ever dare to trust again. When you're feeling this despairing, you can't remember ever having had any hope whatsoever. Integration statements do not correct the bad, but instead make space for what cannot yet be held. In other words, integration statements address both the good and the bad aspects of experience. They begin by resonating empathically with the patient's experience of the bad, the pain, the rage, the despair, and then gently juxtapose this with the patient's difficulty in the face of such affective intensity, accessing any sense of the good. That difficulty might involve the struggle to recall past good or to envision the possibility of future good. These interventions do not boldly counter the bad with an in-your-face reminder, but rather leave space for the patient to get there eventually on their own. I want to kind of move on here. In sum, integration statements involve respectfully, compassionately, and non-judgmentally aligning with the patient's defensive need to forget and to foreclose in moments of emotional overwhelm. At the same time, integration statements subtly invite awareness of, and at times even subliminally evoke awakening of, the patient's adaptive capacity to remember, to envision. I know that's a lot, so you may want to go back and review those. I'm so sorry, but I still want to move on here. Okay, as such, in the bottom line here, integration statements follow the tradition of generating optimally stressful, that is, creating the precise balance of support and challenge, growth incentivizing mismatch experiences between the defensive need to keep the good and the bad split and the adaptive capacity to integrate the good and the bad. All right. Okay, now mentalization. Here we go. I'll be very eager to hear what people have to say about these relatively new addition to my toolkit, the armamentarium. Okay, to nurture the capacity to mentalize, most relevant, so there are 6 slides here, most relevance, resonating patients, splitting defense, stating it's hard to remember. Yes. Resonating when you say it's hard to remember. That is the resonating with their defensive splitting. Yes, it's hard to remember. That is right, Sharon. That's right. Thank you for that. She's a musician also. All right. So to nurture the capacity to mentalize, most relevant for those struggling with borderline vulnerability and fragile capacity, yet ultimately relevant across all diagnostic categories. I've created a 2-part, surprise, surprise, intervention to which I refer as a mentalization statement. These statements invite the patient, as has been said, these aren't my words, to think about thinking, to wonder about wondering, and to hold mind in mind is the way sometimes mentalizing capacity is described. More specifically, my mentalization statements gently support the patient's efforts to make sense of and to cultivate reflective awareness about the underlying mental states of both self and others, even as these interventions respectfully acknowledge inevitable moments of confusion, uncertainty, and not knowing. Whether stemming from developmental limitation, that really is inability, or defensive strategy, unwillingness, or even we could say refusal. Uh, as with all the optimally stressful growth incentivizing interventions in the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy, these strategically constructed statements either first or second, but alternately do both by the time you're done with the sentence, challenge the defense, whether it's limitation or strategy, and also support it. First, increasing anxiety, then easing it. Although in this case with mentalization statements, usually you're going to increase the anxiety. You're going to challenge first and then support. But eventually you can do either way, depending upon the feel of the moment. Okay, now here we go. So, okay, first you gently challenge by leading the witness just enough to stretch them toward mentalization about either their own or the other's mental state. But then you cushion it with empathic support. You are inviting them to lean into curiosity about either their own and or the other's inner experience and its impact on behavior. But then you soften it by resonating empathically with their confusion and lack of certainty. So Fonagy and Bateman and the others talk about two different kinds. Self-internal, they call it, focus, or other external focus. So I had to come up with two different, slightly different mentalization statements. Here we go. There's that it's important that you, and you can say eventually or not, depending upon the feel of things, it's important that you eventually, at some point, be able, speaking to the capacity or ability, be able to make sense of, make meaning of, to be able to put into words, bring to conscious awareness. So it's important that you eventually be able to make sense of the anger, the desire for revenge, whatever, that you're feeling, thinking, or doing right now, and its potential impact on others. But it's not always easy to know exactly what that might be. Other external focus, very similar. It's important that you, at some point, eventually be able, capacity, to make sense of, to make meaning of the X that the other person might be feeling, thinking, or doing right now, and its potential impact on you. But it's not always easy to know exactly what that might be. So I will be very interested in somebody coming up with some constructive criticism or even maybe destructive criticism. Well, no, let's keep it constructive, or offer a possibility of one. I've not thought this through as much as I should. I still need more time to work on this. But here are some self-internal mentalization statements. But my eyes on the time because I want to get through and then have input from you guys. Okay, highlighting the interplay of experience, cognition, and behavior. It's important that you eventually be able, there's a typo there, to understand why you're always so angry and how that can impact people. But at this moment, it just seems too overwhelming even to think about. It's important that you be able at some point to make sense of the agitation that you're feeling right now and what it might prompt you to do, but it's just not that easy to understand. Not that easy to understand. Yeah, these are really rough draft. It's important that you eventually do other external and self-internal focus represent paranoid schizoid position. They're an effort, thank you, Shireen. They're an effort to get the person to do a better job of mentalizing. It might not be as serious as paranoid schizoid. It's mentalizing capacity is more than just having the capacity for ambivalence. Mentalizing capacity, quite frankly, I think if you're mentalizing capacity, you're completely a whole unit. You're a whole human being who has all sorts of ability and capacity, and so on. So it's not just that you're focused on the paranoid schizoid position. There are people in the depressive position who can benefit from mentalization. Thank you, Shireen. I hope I answered that. Okay, and I can only see some that pop up. I only see some if they're long. I can't read them, but I'll get to them later. Okay, third one. It's important that you eventually be able to make sense of the panic that's rising inside you, but you can't for the life of you figure out what it's all about. Anyway, all right, some more. It's important that eventually you'll be able to figure out why people sometimes get so mad at you and what you might be doing to make that happen. But it isn't always easy to figure out what that might be. It's important that you be able to make sense of why people seem to avoid you, but you can't for the life of you figure out what it's all about. Anyway, that's my effort. I'm really eager to have you guys offer me some that I can then use. After all, I'm going to be meeting with Peter Fonagy in two and a half months, and I don't want to embarrass myself. All right. I want to move on here because I'm more interested in. So there's some slides here about what gets accomplished with these mentalization statements, but I want to move on, please. Okay, gratification of the need for external containment. Now we're talking about what we're really doing in the form of containing statements, integration statements, and mentalization statements. Like, what is that all about? What we're doing is by gratifying, not optimally frustrating, but by gratifying their need for external containment because they lack the internal capacity to be self-containing. This is a new kind of experience. It's a corrective relational experience, model 3. It's a corrective relational experience, model 3. Corrective relational experience, model 3. I got to add that. Okay, here we go. So to facilitate the critically important, here we go, external containment. The therapist draws upon these 3 optimally stressful, growth incentivizing interventions. Just repeating myself here. Containing statements that juxtapose empathic resonance with insistence upon accountability, reminding you, you're feeling terrible right now, cursing the day you ever met me, and convinced that you can never trust me again. Empathic resonance. But we both know, insisting upon accountability, that surviving these crises is part of our work. We've done it before and we'll do it again. Nobody said it would be easy. Okay. Also, integration statements, whereby we juxtapose, again, empathic resonance with invitation to awareness. When you're feeling this enraged, it's hard to remember, right? This is the empathic something, that you had ever felt good. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's resonating with the defense. I mean, it's sort of when you're feeling this enraged, that's empathic. They know they're enraged. And now we are doing it nicely by saying it's hard to remember, but we're actually then going on to name something that might be anxiety provoking because, yeah, it is real hard for them to remember. So that's interesting. Thank you. Shireen's question earlier really helped me to kind of parse this out a little better. It's hard to remember is nicely empathic, but then you go on to like that you had ever felt good about me and our work together. And that's challenging them because, yeah, it's hard to remember. In fact, I don't remember it. And equally hard to imagine that you could ever feel good about us again. And finally, mentalization statements, whereby you juxtapose gentle challenge with empathic cushioning. You know it's important that eventually you be able to figure out what's going on inside that's making you feel so enraged. Makes them a little anxious, right? But it all feels so overwhelming right now that it's hard even to think about what might be provoking your anger. You got that right. All right. As we know, it is the therapist's provision. We're on the home stretch. It is I love these slides here. All right. It is the therapist's provision of external containment that makes it possible for the relationship to continue, despite the frequent storms and crises. Whenever the patient is disappointed, frustrated, or thwarted in her desire, the therapist meets the patient's aggression and survives the patient's repeated attempts to destroy her and their relationship. Again and again, the therapist proves her indestructibility. Now, in surviving the patient's attempts to destroy her, the therapist, again, I'd said this earlier on that slide, that picture of the contained, the therapist gives the patient something she has never before experienced, namely the experience of steadfast containment. Indeed, because usually the patient's out of there and gone, but the therapist, by way of containing statements, integration statements, mentalization statements, and setting firm but gentle and non-punitive limits, and just sort of like and just able to just sort of handle and prove herself indestructible, and not to sort of cringe or retreat or whatever, but to be comfortable with her own aggression and her own capacity. And I've talked sometimes when I supervise about imagining there's sort of like a little bit of wall between you and the patients sometimes when they're in the heat of the rage. Imagine there's a little bit of a protective wall, and you do your thing, and you got to prove to her and to yourself that you're not going to let her annihilate you. That does nobody any good. And you can't retaliate, though you might be tempted to. It's okay. And you can hate them. In fact, Winnicott wrote about Bowie, not Bowie, Bowie, oh, Maltzberger and Bowie, anyway, wrote about countertransference hate, right, in the treatment of certain patients. I don't know, Winnicott or Maltzberger or Bowie. Anyway, they wrote about it. They could have written about it. If they didn't, they could have. Anyway, surviving patient's attempts to destroy, the experience of steadfast containment. Indeed, when the therapist can meet the patient's urgent need to have her impulsive, rageful, and destructive behaviors limited and contained, the patient will gain a new kind of experience. The powerfully transformative experience of having intense affect, including murderous rage, debilitating anxiety, and suicidal despair, without devastating consequence. So I had a patient who came in, and she was a new patient, and and she had cut herself, and so she came to me for the first time, and I kind of knew, because the therapist had referred her, like, oh my God, Martha, you do your thing with her. I knew that the patient was ever busy trying to kill herself and cutting herself. So the patient comes in and sits down and whatever, very engaging in a certain way. And then she pulls her sleeve up and says, look, I just cut myself. And so I went sort of like, oh my God, that looks horrible. Oh God, please, whatever. And then I said, God, unless you want scars on that arm, like you have scars on the other arm, you better put a lot of topical vitamin E on it. And she sort of looked at me, sort of like, whatever. Anyway, she and I went on to work together for many years. And there were some more suicide attempts, but anyway, she never killed herself. All right. She did go to the emergency room to be evaluated, however, 1 or 2 times. All right, but anyway, new kind of experience. Yes, the powerfully transformative experience of having intense affect without devastating consequence. In the moments of devastating disillusionment, here we go. The patient with borderline defenses, lacking the internal structure to weather the crisis, see, that's what we're talking about here, loses hold of all that had once been good. In the grip of her unmodulated, dysregulated rage, she is drawn toward retaliation, even if it means destroying the very relationship she has come to treasure. The therapist's willingness and ability to meet the patient's aggression, her unwavering steadfastness in the face of it, and her consistent provision of external containment by way of those 3 kinds of interventions of the patient's destructive acting out will enable the relationship not only to survive, but to endure and evolve. Survival here meaning the ever-evolving capacity of the relationship to withstand the frequent storms and inevitable crises that would once have torn the relational fabric apart. But the therapist refuses to allow the patient to destroy the relationship, just as she refuses to allow herself to be abused. Indeed, if the patient is gently yet firmly anchored in the relationship by a therapist who steadfastly refuses to collude with the patient's impulse to destroy, and instead offers a protected space within which the patient can give voice to her anguish, her panic, her desperation, her outrage, her wish to escape, to lash out, to retaliate, even to destroy, then in time, she might be able to reclaim the good feelings she once knew. Not because the rage has been silenced, but because it has been welcomed into language, mentalization, met with empathy and understanding, held within the therapist's emotional robustness, such a good word, and allowed to run its true course, without judgment, without retaliation, without collapse, held, named, and understood, not enacted by patient or therapist, though if a little bit you do it every now and then, that could happen. You don't go to hell for it because we know you're doing the best you can. Perhaps months, perhaps weeks, sometimes even days. But with each exchange, sorry, I'm thinking about times when I acted out a little bit with one of my patients where I pounded my fist on the arm of my chair and I said, "Shut up." That's not really a two-part growth incentivizing intervention. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted her to shut up. Well, anyway, I kind of hurt my hand a little bit. So then I have to go like this a little bit. And she said, "Serves you right." And we both laughed. All right, did serve me right, but whatever. She did shut up, let me say, and then we did go on. So in a way, that there in the moment, that could have been a traumatic stressor. I'm not claiming I was at my best, but if you kind of work and process it, mentalize it and do all sorts of whatever, then you can actually transform it into something that, though initially disrupts and destabilizes, ultimately restores, and there's recovery and repair. Ever stronger at the broken places. Okay. Anyways, that's important here. So, and instead offers a protective space within which the patient can give voice to her anguish, panic, desperation, outrage, wish to escape, to lash out, to retaliate, even to destroy. Then in time, she might be able to reclaim the good feelings she had once known. Oh, here, I've said it, but I want to say it again. I already said this. Yeah, perhaps months, perhaps weeks, sometimes even days. But with each exchange, the patient moves closer to reclaiming that which was lost, step by step, within the calm, steady hold of the relationship. Okay, now in time, the patient begins to recover her good feelings. The disappointment is survived, and the relationship, at least for the moment, endures. Okay, the therapist can then introduce something to which I refer as an inverted integration statement. Oh my God. These interventions are used not when the patient is feeling bad, but in those moments when hope has returned and the patient is truly feeling good. Now, how perverted is that? An inverted integration statement, let me explain, underlines the fact that when the patient is truly feeling good, it can become difficult to recall the bad that had come before. When you're feeling this good, it's hard to remember that you had ever had doubts about me and our work together. When you're feeling hopeful, as you are now, you find yourself wanting to forget about the times when you were filled with despair, rage, and deep uncertainty. What are you doing here? In essence, the therapist maintaining her perspective throughout both the lows and the highs of the therapeutic engagement is simply reminding the patient that this too shall pass, not because the therapist is a Debbie Downer, but because she seeks to highlight the continuity of the patient's internal experience, the continuity of her being, the thread connecting past, present, and future. In this way, she is attempting to integrate, adaptive integration, as opposed to defensive splitting, both the good and the bad aspects of the patient's experience of self and others, modeling that very integration through her interventions. In addition to containing integration and mentalization statements, the therapist then makes liberal use of both the well, I said the integration statement, recognizing how hard it is to remember the good in the face of the present bad, and the inverted integration statement, that needs to be reworked, reminding the patient of the bad that had preceded the current experience of good. All right, hang in here, please. The alternation between bad followed by good and good followed by bad, frustration giving way to gratification, gratification giving way to frustration, becomes a recursive integrative rhythm within the patient's evolving experience of the therapist. This ongoing oscillation between rupture and repair, between satisfaction and disappointment, establishes a deep emotional cadence, an ever expanding flow within the relational field. And I don't know if you've experienced this with some of your patients, not even just the ones with borderline features, but where it'll be sort of and then better and then and then better. It's an interesting something where the period of time between the disruption and the recover gets ever shorter often. This ongoing oscillation, I said that, establishes a deep emotional cadence, right? An ever expanding flow within the relational field. Patient and therapist continually meeting at their intimate edge, navigating the delicate interplay of vulnerability and strength. In so doing, they gradually cultivate a foundation of mutual trust, because it goes both ways, and deepening understanding. And in the aftermath, each time of kind of working this through, whew, I mean, there is kind of a wonderful, like, for the moment, but knowing, of course, there'll be another moment because it's an ongoing process. Iterative healing cycles, disruption, repair, disruption, repair, disruption in reaction to challenge, repair in response to support, but gradually evolving to ever higher levels of integration, balance, and resilience, and evocative memory capacity. Okay. The integrative process of containment, integration, and mentalization, working in dynamic synergy, one of my favorite words, synergy, unfolds as follows. The patient experiences disappointment, struggles to tolerate it, and feels sorely tempted to act out in impulsive, rageful, indulgent, and/or destructive ways. But the stalwart therapist, reliable and unwavering, provides external containment anchored by containing statements, fosters adaptive integration of good and bad by means of integration statements and inverted integration statements, and cultivates reflective awareness facilitated by mentalization statements, all of which deter the patient's proneness to defensive splitting and unreflective acting out in the face of emotional overwhelm. The therapist repeatedly demonstrates her reliability, consistency, and faith in the durability of the patient and of their connection. I'm getting right near the end here, which allows the relationship to endure, the storm to be weathered, and the patient's good feelings to be restored. The cycle repeats itself again and again. The patient's inner experience becomes one of storm stillness, crisis resolution, rupture repair, loss recovery, disappointment relief, bad good, again and again and again. The oscillation progresses at an ever accelerating pace, with the recovery time after each destabilizing disillusionment growing shorter and shorter. And eventually, what you can do, you've done so many of these statements and you've so been there that even in the midst of it, you look at the patient, you say, I don't know how long it's going to take this time, where we're both feeling all sorts of stuff in relation to each other. But quite frankly, as we've learned in the past, this too shall pass. Though maybe hard for us, hard for you, maybe in the moment hard for me to remember, but this too shall pass. Eventually, the two of you are just really navigating and working at your intimate edge. In essence, the patient discovers that she can, time and again, survive the vacillation between the bad and the good, between devastating lows and enlivening highs. And in turn, the therapeutic relationship itself grows increasingly resilient, strengthening precisely at the broken places. The patient is beginning to experience, in a deeply embodied way, the coalescing impact of this rhythmic, cyclical dance of being in relationship with someone who remains steady, reliable, durable, committed, and emotionally invested, who stays empathically attuned even amid repeated ruptures, refusing to withdraw, funny spelling for that word, retaliate or give up. And so, perhaps for the first time, the patient finds herself beginning to believe that storms can be weathered, disappointments can be survived, and a new beginning is possible. The patient's repeated embodied experience of rupture and repair, loss and recovery, bad and good, in ever more rapid succession, gradually cultivates the internal capacity to hold in mind the full lived experience. And I think about all the times, I mean, it doesn't happen every time, by the way, but all the times I've been able to do that with my people. And it's very powerful when they can do it. They can now, they have the dual awareness. They now have the capacity to be internally self-containing. And they say, I know, I would want to be able to whatever, but as I know, if I do that, then I lose this thing that means more to me than anything else has ever meant to me before. And they start to create their own containing statements, which means they now have this hard-earned developmental capacity to provide themselves with internal self-containment. And you, in essence, have modeled that for them by providing that. We're not talking about that they grieved anything. No, 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 no. This is gratification of a need, not optimal frustration. Mm-mm-mm-mm. There'll be plenty of time later for optimal frustration once they are now developing the capacity for evocative memory, the capacity to remember. Okay, so the repeated embodied experience of bad, good, bad, good, bad, good gradually cultivates the internal capacity to hold in mind the full lived experience of both bad and good simultaneously. Not only the loved and hated aspects of the object, but also the loving and hateful dimensions of the self. This deeply lived relational rhythm fosters an increasingly consolidated sense of self and others, each capable of harboring both the good and the bad. And here I'm reminded of, I've told this story before, but please, if I can, let me say it again. And that is a patient of mine who certainly had a lot of issues, like trouble integrating good and bad, not necessarily patient, well, defensive splitting. So anyway, she wanted me to write on a sheet of paper, and she herself, a therapist, knew that this was like a big deal. But she wanted me to write on a sheet of paper, I love you very, very much, because she would forget. And she wanted to have this on a sheet of paper, and I was to sign it. And this is a big deal. I mean, for us therapists to put that on a sheet of paper, like, think about, the therapeutic police and so on. But okay, fair enough. So I wrote a name, dear, whatever. I said, I love you very, very much. And I signed it. She called me Dr. Stark. Most people call me Martha. But anyway, I signed it, Dr. Stark. I gave it to her. And she was very pleased. But she came back the next time with the same sheet of paper. And she said, I really appreciate it. It was kind of crumpled, by the way, but like clearly she'd been touching it quite a bit. But anyway, she said, this is good, but I'd like something a little more. I would like it to be that you love me, even when, I'm not always that lovable. So I said, okay. I said, let me have the sheet back, please. So I wrote, I love you very, very much, even though sometimes you're a big baby and a fucking asshole. Now, let me say, that is something, those were words that we had used. And she said, yes, I love that, that you love me even when I'm like really bad. I said, yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. So she took that sheet of paper and was very, very happy. And she never brought that back, though she would actually, she did something that one other patient did as well. And that is, but especially this other patient would come to me periodically for consultation. She had a piece of paper that her therapist had written some lovely stuff on. And she held it so close that it had become like a cloth, and she would hold it up. I would always ask her each time. She'd come back every 3 to 6 months just for a little touch base. She was in ongoing 3 times a week therapy with someone, but the therapist would send her back periodically. She would come back and she would hold, I'd say, can I see it? And she would hold up this thing that had become, it had been a sheet of paper, and now it's like a piece of cloth because she'd been so busy cherishing it and loving it. Anyway, and my patient also a little bit did that to the thing that I'd written. All right, moving on here. I'm almost done. My eyes on the time. Oh my God. Okay, at this point, the patient who once struggled with Okay, good. I'm sorry. I know there are going to be some comments here, and I just love it. So please feel free because I'm going to get them as soon as I'm done here. At this point, the patient who once struggled with defensive splitting and the pre-ambivalent use of part objects is relating to others not as all good or all bad part objects that either gratify or frustrate, but as good and bad whole objects capable of both gratifying and frustrating. The patient who was once unable to self-contain unintegrated psychic tension and overwhelming affective storms, and therefore pre-reflectively enacted internal dramas on the stage of her life in impulsive, rageful, and often destructive ways, the patient has now developed the capacity to hold painful oscillations within the self and to withstand emotional turbulence without discharging internal turmoil into the external world. She no longer needs to play out dysregulated internal states in her relationships, but instead can hold, reflect, and ultimately mentalize them. Mentalize as a transitive verb, and ultimately mentalize them within a more cohesive, integrated, and enduring sense of self. Final reflections. In sum, with respect to the development of evocative memory capacity in patients who revert to, I've got to change that too, patients who revert to borderline defenses in the face of overwhelm, it will not be the patient's experience of grieving disillusionment with an idealized self-object therapist to fill in self-deficit, but rather the experience of being held in relationship by a containing self-object therapist who proves herself indestructible, refusing to be daunted by the patient's disillusionment, outrage, or threats to act out impulsively and ragefully. In other words, it will be the patient's consistent gratification of the patient's need for containment that will provide both the impetus and the opportunity for development of evocative memory capacity, and therefore the patient's capacity to grieve. I hope you are getting it, that you have to have evocative memory capacity in order to do genuine grieving. And if you have relentless hope, it's because you'd never had a certain something early on, idealized perfect caregiving, and so are ever busy looking for it in the here and now because you have a self or structural deficit to be a good caregiver unto yourself. And it's going to be by way of delivering that into the self-object, narcissistic self-object transference, and working it through there, the disillusionment, the disruptions of the positive narcissistic self-object transference, that you will gradually internalize the good that has been there, and in the process fill in deficit and become better able to become your own source of sustenance. Good enough, perfect enough, approximately perfect. Okay, in essence, transformation of the relentless search for external perfection into self-sustaining resilience, and the internal acceptance of good enough will be the felicitous outcome of all of this. As a result, not of grieving optimal failure, but of encountering optimal disillusionment. Ultimately, resilient self-support, being able to be a good caregiver unto oneself, the adaptive capacity to be a good enough caregiver unto oneself, thank you, Winnicott, will become the antidote to the relentless pursuit of idealized external caregiving and perfect attunement. You need to grieve. The hard-earned ability, which patients with borderline stuff can now do, in fact, we're not even really calling them borderlines anymore. The hard-earned ability to be deeply satisfied with being the source of one's own sustenance. That's what we're talking about here. And if you don't have that, then you have relentless hope. and with the good enough, let's see, the hard-earned ability to be deeply satisfied with being the source of one's own sustenance, and with the good enough attunement uh, real life provides, is the hallmark of successful transformation from relentless hope into reality-based hope. So some people say, well, isn't hope good? Well, yeah. But relentless hope, not so much. Reality-based or realistic hope or mature hope, yes. By the same token, I talk about optimal stress, and some people will say, well, isn't stress bad? Well, traumatic stress is, but optimal stress isn't. Anyway, from relentless hope into reality-based hope, the sober, mature acceptance that storms can be weathered, disappointments can be survived, and a new beginning will be possible. All right, from relentless hope for external provision, I have one more slide of perfect caregiving to self-sustaining resilience and internal acceptance of the good enough. Last slide. I'm reminded of a beloved patient of mine who entered treatment with a diagnosis of BPD, a trail of failed therapies behind her, and a series of exhausted, defeated, and enraged therapists in her wake. But after 8 years of intensive psychodynamic work with me, through many battles, repeated efforts to take me down, and begrudged grieving along the way, as she came to terms with previously unbearable truths, she was no longer a borderline. Her parting words as we terminated still resonate. You're the kind of person who would kick the crutches out from underneath a cripple. Thank you. I still chuckle as I remember. Now, I know some of you think like, oh my God. And I think the others, like Steve Kolb, for example, and Philip Plattner, get it. It's sort of like, yes, yeah, no longer a borderline. Yeah, kick the crutches out from underneath the cripple. She didn't really have the learned something or the inability even. I still chuckle as I remember, and she has stayed in touch with me over the course of the years, much to my delight, and is clearly doing very well. All right, well, that's it. Now, let me just stop share, and let me just see here if I could just real quick like say hello, and then I'm going to look at these things in the chat. All right, good. So let me just have the pleasure of this. And then, oh, some of you are still here. Oh, good. Philip and Gil Fox still, and Fiona with 3 names. Ehsan, dear Ehsan. And Steve Kolb, Nancy Thurston. Well, hello, Nancy. Oh, good. I had not seen that you were here. Aizwan still. Thank you, Aizwan. And Professor Dr. Ava. And Mita. Hello, Mita. And Karen still. Thank you. Jean-Francois, Bernard, and Shireen. And I think, let's see, a few more. Carol Willis still here. Thank you. Gil Buff. Oh, good. Lema. Thank you, Lema. And Christine. Oh, good. So I still have some of you all here. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And the rest of you, I think and hope, will be listening to the recording. You'll get that tomorrow. All right, so let me look at some of these things here. So we do have some, we have some comments. Thank you. So we have, let me just get this here. Okay. Yes, so Dr. Ava, yes, I mentioned Margaret Muller, whose concept is so important for our work, and certainly in her work with infant, child, and adolescent patient work. Oh, Jean-Francois, I think the relinquishment, says he, of relentless hope is so difficult for the patient, even impossible at early stages of the therapeutic process. Yeah, I think because there needs to have been the optimal frustration, which provides impetus and opportunity. But let's see what you go on to say. Even impossible at early stages of the therapeutic process, because for the patient, the relinquishment of what the therapist can see as being an unrealistic, perfect response, beautiful. And what I talk about, what a panel of 10,000 objective judges, and you very nicely are highlighting what the therapist can see as being an unrealistic, perfect response, is felt as the relinquishment of any hope of the vitally needed emotional response. God, this is beautifully written. Yes, this hoped for response cannot be less than perfect from the point of view of the patient still with relentless hope, because the imperfections are inevitably felt as traumatic, as the traumatic repetition, absolutely, of failures and refusals of the needed response. Absolutely. Thank you, Jean-Francois. And let me highlight here that sometimes what will also happen is, and of course, obviously people can sign off. I mean, I know I'm running way over here, but again, the recording will be available. And next Thursday, I'm starting my entirely free spot supervision Zoom sessions, and people presenting. And I think there's now one spot of 14 Thursdays, because they're almost every week, not Thanksgiving and not Christmas, I guess. One spot still open for a case presenter, but otherwise 13 are filled. All right, but anyway, well, I lost him. I got so excited about my spot supervision sessions. They start next week. I love them. I just love them. All right, let me just see. I forgot what I was saying because I got so excited. It's traumatic repetition. It'll come to me. It'll come to me. All right, Karen. This is so Bionian. Oh, I'm glad. Let's see. The therapist, I know about a little bit of that, and beta elements and so on, and alpha function and so on. The therapist is modeling demonstration. Oh, yes, of the therapist alpha function. Oh, okay, right. Yes, 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 yes. Yes, a function. Oh, so Bion then was talking about modeling. Thank you. I did not know that. And Bion was there before Fonagy. So I stand corrected. Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. A function can now be internalized by the patient who did not get it in childhood. Oh, thank you. It also calls to mind, oh, Mark Solms and Friston's. I don't even know who Friston is, but thank you. I'll have to check that out. Work with the Markov blanket, a permeable membrane supporting differentiation of self and other. Oh my God. Well, thank you, Karen. Markov blanket. I think I have a little research to do. Thank you for that. Thank you, Karen. All right, Gina Kwan. This makes me think about how ruptures or failures can feel traumatic when there hasn't been sufficient repair. There's not enough underlying resilience yet, or the development of a capacity for repair. Although also, I don't know what you're going to go on to say, but I also want to say, in the moment, something can be experienced as traumatic, but as a result of working it through, this is so important, as a result of working it through, what had once been experienced as traumatic, i.e. as too much, I go up on my toes, too much for the patient to process, integrate, and adapt to, as a result of working it through and recontextualizing it, reframing it, grieving it, what had once been experienced as traumatic, it's now the same thing, but it's experienced as optimal. And I've certainly had this in my work with a lot of patients where I'll do something, they'll do something, we're really tussling it out at our intimate edge, and Darlene Ehrenberg's intimate edge. And it feels like traumatic, quite frankly, to us both. But as a result of doing all sorts of stuff, including, I hope, some mentalizing and so forth, what had been a traumatic disruption caused by my doing a certain something or my not doing a certain something or our co-creating a certain something or not, becomes then retroactively experienced as optimal. And in fact, elsewhere I've talked about it, and this is fundamental to the Stark method of psychodynamic synergy, highlighting that it's a perspectivism, also constructivism and plenty of other things too, but a perspectival, if that's the word, perspectivist approach, that it's how you position yourself. It's sort of like the particle wave duality of quantum theory, the observer effect, and how you position yourself in relation to the event, the particle wave or whatever. How you position yourself depends. It depends on whether you experience it as traumatic or you experience it as optimal. And if it's traumatic, then you defensively react in all sorts of not good ways and develop all sorts of narratives that are disempowering and distorted and not so good and rigid and all. But if you're able, in relation to that very same thing, to process, integrate, and adapt, what with your underlying resilience and getting enough support in the treatment, then that there becomes an optimal stressor and no longer now a defensive reaction on your part. Yeah, we're thinking about Viktor Frankl, no longer a defensive reaction, but now an adaptive response to what is now experienced as an optimal stressor. And in essence, with these different interventions, the 5 different kinds of prototypical interventions, but you can do other things too, but just in order to try to create it, to teach it, the 5 prototypical interventions, we are creating optimally stressful situation for the patient, which means that we are stressing them, but it's optimally stressful, so we hope. Even though in the moment, it might be in certain cases we overshot the mark and they experience it as traumatic. And so like, oh, then we're trying to backpedal. We need to help them process it together. We negotiate, we do whatever, so that ultimately what might have been experienced as traumatic, or maybe even was a real misstep on our part, becomes an optimal something that is growth promoting. By definition, optimal provides impetus and opportunity for growth. Whereas by definition, and I lifted this, I think, from self-psychology, hello, Dr. Ava. But anyway, traumatic disappointment, traumatic disillusionment is stuff that really in the moment can't be processed, integrated, and adapted to. And let me also say that in essence, what we're talking about is, I believe profoundly that we all have underlying innate resilience, innate immunity, if you will, but anyway, innate resilience. But as a result of working through all of the disappointments and the grieving of disruptions to what had been a positive transference and having evocative memories so you can remember that the good that the therapist had been providing, the therapist is a stand-in for the early on caregiver, as you can remember that and thereby adaptively internalize it, preserving internally a piece of the original experience of the good that was, then you fill in deficit and become for yourself your own self-sustaining, own internal capacity to be a good enough parent unto yourself. And no longer are you needing to be relentless in your pursuit of perfect idealized caregiving from the outside. Amen. Okay, but anyway, so I hope that makes sense. I get a few smiles there, so that's a good thing. All right. But Gina, I was in the middle of Gina's. So let me just say, early on, yes, there can be a honeymoon phase and it can sort of seem as if like a transference cure, it can seem like all is well, but maybe not so much. Just seems that way. The ability to repair seems essential for grieving, and grieving is essential for the ability to repair, for recognizing, feeling, and making meaning, thank you, of loss. And mentalization helps us to really understand that concept, make meaning of, create a narrative about, put into words, come to understand, conscious awareness of. And it's through, and though it often is done by way of first the implicit, the experiencing of it, the felt sense, the experiencing of it, but ultimately then finding the words. So from implicit to explicit is what I think many of them, Bion and Soames, I guess, thank you, and Fonagy are talking about. So initially more implicit, and I think I would want to say my suggestions about how we provide the external containment. Initially, it's a kind of just experience, lived experience. Yeah, I was calling it a lived experience, but I guess I should say, I think I'm going to add the word implicit. I'm going to add the word implicit. The implicit experience, lived implicit experience, and then ultimately finding the words for it, mentalizing it. Yes, okay, I'm going to add the word implicit. All right, let's see. The ability to repair seems essential for grieving, for recognizing, feeling, and making meaning of loss. Thank you, Gina, absolutely, Gina Kwan. And it's through that grieving that we find, the courage to keep loving, trying, and opening ourselves again and again, despite past and future losses. And let me say, I've mentioned this a couple of times, but I want to mention it again. Gina Kwan and Teresa Tisdale have invited me to speak in September on Saturday, September 20th. I think that's the right time. Saturday, September 20th on the holding and the provocation, navigating the edge between support and challenge in contemporary relational theory. And I hope you'll all, I'll be sending out notices, and I hope you'll all sign up for it. You get CE credits. You get CE credits. You pay a little bit, but you get CE. You pay very little bit, and you get CE credits if you want by paying a little extra. Okay. Back to this. So, and opening ourselves again and again, despite past and future losses. It reminds me that cycles of rupture and repair, winning and losing, celebrating and grieving, celebrating is a good one, all belong to a larger whole. Ah, the arc of life itself. Be still, my beating heart. Thank you, Gina Kwan. Oh, God, isn't this very similar to a conflict statement? Thank you, Gail. And I had answered that. Thanks very much for the explanation. Okay, Gina Kwan. Are all therapists doomed to fail unless there's the experience of working through the therapist's inevitable failures? So are all therapies doomed to fail? Well, I think I would say that it depends upon if you're looking at trying to do, it's called second order, deep embodied structural work, then I personally believe that you need to have had the experience of working through disruption repair, no pain, no gain, destabilization of rigidly entrenched dysfunctional defenses, and then restabilization at a slightly higher level, and these ongoing cycles. However, there are plenty of therapies that can be done, and I've done them with patients who either had no interest in doing deep structural work, and or kind of would have wanted to maybe, but they just weren't able, willing, wanting to give the level of commitment. So I just did all sorts of other stuff. I don't call it second order change, but I did stuff enough that they could now file their tax information, or they could now, get their resume done so that they could apply for another job. I mean, I'm not saying we did deep, deep embodied work and that they arrived at the 5 A's: awareness, comprehensive, all-encompassing awareness, acceptance, model 2, accountability, model 3, accessibility and relational presence, model 4, and actualizing action, model 5. No, but they got something done, and that's all good. So no, I'm a little more thinking about, so are all therapies doomed to fail? No, they're just not going to go as deep, I believe, unless there has been the opportunity for the working through of what had been traumatic failures, but now in the treatment, belatedly, there's the opportunity, belatedly, to convert what had been traumatic stressors early on, which had given rise to the filters, the distorted, old, bad, disempowering filters through which the patient was experiencing the world. Now there's the opportunity to convert them into more optimal stressors, including the therapist's own interventions that are stressful, hopefully eventually optimal as they are being worked through. So another way to put this, though, by the way, is, and I haven't yet said this, but there is the concept, as you all know, of patients who, projective identification, we're thinking model 3, who draw us into failing them in ways, and again, I'm just quoting Patrick Casement, in ways specifically determined by their early on developmental history. And now these are my words: internally recorded and structuralized in the form of internal bad objects. Those extra words are mine. Whereby the patient then is ever busy, projective identification, in the induction phase of a projective identification, my concept of induction phase, drawing you into participating as the old bad. Here's a trick question for you. When you do indeed find yourself drawn in, are you actually challenging them or actually supporting them in some way? You're actually supporting, you're actually validating. You were drawn into participating as some version of the old bad. Jean-Francois, you get that? Whereas when you then respond in a way that whereby you step back and hold yourself more accountable and provide a little more containment, and are available to talk about what's been co-created at the intimate edge of transference, countertransference, entanglement, and returning to the patient in the resolution phase, some piece of something that's now slightly processed and integrated, then it is that you're challenging the patient. So when it turns out that you're exactly what they feared you would be, that's more like same old, same old. But then when you are able to step back from that, hold yourself accountable, and give them back a new experience, new relational experience, that's the challenge. So when patients are busy thinking of, now you're nodding, Jean-Francois, when patients are busy thinking of you as being critical, that's easy for them. I mean, even though, quite frankly, on some level, they'd rather not, because they're ambivalently invested in defenses. We all are. But the part of them that would want you to fail them as they've been failed in the past, let me just clarify that. It's just so obvious in a way. It highlights if you were not to fail them and you were to actually be not the critical that the parent had been, and you were to actually be loving and very present and compassionate, then it would highlight that things could be and could therefore have been different. And now that means they'd have to confront the intolerably painful reality that the parent did stuff they never should have done. So it's much easier for them, under the sway of the reenactment or repetition compulsion, to assume that you, like the old ones, will fail them in the very same ways. So on some level, they are ever busy recreating that because they have an investment in that. On the other hand, there's also desire for belated mastery. All right, well, moving on, because I know we're oh my God. All right. Anyway, I know we now have one person left. That's not true. We don't have just one person left. All right, but let me just see. Is that what makes therapy successful? When the patient is, yeah, deep embodied work does require the working through of inevitable failures. And those inevitable failures, in model 2, in self-psychology, the inevitability of failure is, for the most part, thought, I believe, and because therapists and parents can't be perfect and aren't expected to be perfect. Like, there will be inevitable failure. That's model 2. In model 3, the more intersubjective perspective, the reason the therapist will fail the patient might also be that, but it's also projective identification. The patient is ever busy exerting pressure on the therapist to fail them in the old familiar ways. Okay. All right. Now we move on. Shireen, resonating patients splitting defense, stating it's hard to remember. Yes, that piece of it is resonating. Thank you for that. And I already answered that. Do other represent? Yeah, no, not so much the pyramid schizoid. Okay, Nancy Thurston. Okay, good. Do patients really tend to experience, yeah. No, they have mixed feelings about it, but ultimately it does enable them to stay. Yes. Well, mine do. Whatever. I don't know. I mean, and my supervisees, I don't know, theirs do. But I wouldn't say gratifying, but they feel that it's being met and they feel held and contained. Yes. And they feel safer. So yes, I don't know that they'd say like, oh, good, my therapist really contained me. I feel good. But they do experience it as containing. My experience is they tend to experience it as a rupture. Oh, I see. Yeah, no, not mine. Of the interpersonal bridge, frustrating and shaming, even when the limits are offered in a calm interpersonal context with the patient. I don't, by the way, always offer it in a very calm way, parenthetically. But yeah, no, I guess it could be that way. Yes, that they don't like it. Yeah, no, listen, there's so many things I do with my patients they're not okay with and they don't love it. But the most important thing is that they keep coming back. We got to have them in the relationship for us to be able to work with them. But so no, I appreciate that. So it might well be that providing containing statements for certain patients isn't really going to work terribly well. Yeah. Okay. Is the gratifying aspect of the external containment the patient's experience? Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nancy. That is it. The patient's experience of the analyst showing up and again for sessions with the patient, even after the patient's acts of spite. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. That was a beautiful way of putting what I hadn't even quite gotten to. So it reminds me of, yes, here we go. So a patient of mine, well, of course, yes, a patient of mine, we would have sessions. She had some borderline features for sure. Anyway, what we would do is we would have a session. We had just one a week. Okay, we had one a week. But we had established a rhythm of that we would have the session and then if we felt that there was sort of some unfinished business, either one of us could say, maybe we could have a second session later this week. And it was either of us, but often I would say that. All right. But anyway, so we had a session where there was a major rupture. And certainly from her point of view, and probably the panel of 10,000 objective judges would have said yes from their point of view as well, I'd made a big boo-boo, a big boo-boo. And she was, quite frankly, hating my guts. And and just wondering if the therapy was worth anything, for Christ's sakes, and really angry, really angry. So we get to the end of the session. So I am mustering up every little bit of courage that I could. I said, after she said the therapy counts for nothing, I don't even know why I bothered to come. I said, would you want, I probably stuttered it a little bit because I said, would you want, would we want to have another session later this week? And she said, hell no. Anyway, so, okay, just asking. Anyway, but later, not immediately after, she did come back the next week, et cetera, et cetera. Later, she was to say to me, thank you. Thank you for knowing that even though in the moment I was hating your guts and thinking the therapy and you counted for squat, that you still remembered us and that you offered yourself. You get that? Yeah, and Mita's smiling on that one. Yeah, that was so. Nancy, thank you for that. You love that. Is the gratifying aspect? Absolutely, you said it better than I did. Of the external containment, of the patient's experience of the analyst is the patient's experience of the analyst showing up again and again for sessions with the patient, even after the patient's act of spite. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. That's exactly right. Okay, Shireen. Yes, Martha, I am experiencing one of my current patients, borderline intrapsychic structure, rupture and repair modes many times. Yeah, nobody said it'd be easy. Thank you so much, said Anita, for this presentation. Very useful and insightful. I have to leave now. Understood. Gina Kwan, I have to go. I look forward to listening to the recording later. Thank you. Thank you so much for these generous teachings, Martha. I look forward to seeing you in the group next week for the spot supervision. All you have to do, a lot of you who've still hung on here are actually in the group. Are actually in the group. And now Mita is for sure. But anyway, so let's see. Okay, Charlotte Stills, who is in the group actually. Many thanks indeed, Martha. What a roller coaster. Wonderful stuff. I also have to go, but we'll catch up later. Thank you so much. Eli, thank you. This is so wonderful. Thank you so much, said Nancy Reed. And finally, Philip Plattner, who always kind of comes in right at the end, and I love that. Got signed on early and comes in at the end here. Thank you for sharing all your years of reflection. I'm so glad that my decades of something is a good thing. Your years, decades of reflection and experience about working with people to address their emotional difficulties, to help us be all that we might be in our endeavors to help others. Thank you, Philip. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Martha, said Jareen. Mita, thank you so much, Dr. Stark. Let's see. Have to head out. Thanks so much for inviting me. Thank you, Gail. Thanks, Martha, said Aizwan. Mita, please send the instructions for how to enroll. Oh, yes. All you have to do is email. Mita. Steve Kolb, thank you, very clear and helpful. Mita, Frank, frequently one comes across patients who want certain things, for example, meaningful love, more self-esteem, which may need some deeper structural change, but do not want to do the work. Any tips to help them? I realize not an easy situation. This is where I can go with, you would so have wished that I could say something that would enable you to feel all better or would enable you to feel deeply cherished and loved. But you're coming to understand that sadly, it doesn't always work that way. And it's devastating or it's enraging. You would so have wished. You would so have wished that it could work that way. But you're beginning to understand that sometimes it takes more than just that. So I can say stuff like that. But you want a deeper. Yes, and the thing I don't do anymore, although I used to do it and embarrassed myself many times over, is I would say, well, often people will want to be able to, like, people who didn't get it consistently and reliably early on will want to be able to come in now and get it and then feel all better. And like my patient who said, I come here not to cry, I come here to feel better. I understand that. But anyway, but try to explain it, I have in my time and just made a fool of myself by saying stuff like, well, it's not going to be by way of my providing it. that you're going to feel better, but by way of working through those times when I don't provide it, that you will then adaptively internalize, because you have evocative memory capacity, all the good that I had provided in the past. And then you will fill in deficit, and then you'll be able to provide it for yourself, and then we can recover the good that we had had. And don't do that. You'll embarrass yourself. I've done that. I've embarrassed myself. Fortunately, I had a little relentless hope that someday somebody would understand that. Nobody ever understood it. And eventually I just grieved it, let go of it, and sort of like, I don't say that anymore. I just sort of like, well, whatever. All right. So let's see. Here we have Nancy again. All right. Let's see. Thanks, Martha, for this helpful presentation. Thank you, Nancy. Okay. That's it. All right. Well, listen, folks. Thank you all. I want you to have a wonderful, to those of you who are still on, oh, we still have 10. Thank you. Let me just see these good diehards. And Gail and Lema. Thank you, Lema. I don't tend to see you, but I know you're there. And Carol, brilliant Carol still. Dr. Ava, Karen, Jean-Francois, and Karen and John, and Fiona with 3 names, and Mita and Philip. Thank you so much. You have all helped me to have a better summer. Although, as it happens, I do now also have my dear sweet Gunnar here. And it just is wonderful. He's here. And anyway, it's quite wonderful. So I'm looking forward to having a wonderful weekend. And I will periodically be offering more of these entirely free 2-hour PowerPoint Zoom presentations. For now, I got to figure out a way to make my public YouTube channel. Thank you, Fiona with 3 names. Oh, thank you, Lema. Um, my YouTube channel. I do now have a YouTube channel where people can see the 5, for example, and other 2-hour presentations that I've done. That's public viewing. Now the supervision group, people who come into the supervision group and cases are presented, those recordings get posted and are available only to people in the Spot Supervision Zoom community who've been vetted by me. And it's my private YouTube channel because that's private. That's private just for our group and so on, just for our group. But many of you, I think all of you who are still on here, are actually in it, and that's a good thing. Yeah, Carol isn't quite yet, but all of you are in it. And Lema, I think you are. Yeah, Lema, you are. All right. Anyway, so listen. Thank you all. Have a wonderful. Jean-Francois always said, beautiful smile. Fiona with 3 names, and Mita, and Philip, and Professor Dr. Ava. Have a wonderful, wonderful long weekend for many of you, and I look forward to seeing you all in the fall. And there'll be opportunities where I'll present 2 in September where I'm presenting with continuing education credits available, 2 in October that I'm presenting, and others down the road. And then, of course, the November presentation with Peter Fonagy and Nancy McWilliams. Oh, you may think I'm quite nervous about that. Oh, what makes you think I'm nervous? Oh, my God. Be still my beating heart. But anyway, so all right, you all. Bye bye. Take good care.